Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to be looking at Hume's skeptical solution to his problem of induction. In the video, we're going to start by just reviewing what the problem is. Then we're going to look at two different interpretations of the problem. The first is the epistemological interpretation, which is the one that we've used to sort of frame the argument in the first place. But we'll also look at an alternative psychological interpretation of what Hume's doing. After looking at those interpretations, we'll look at what Hume calls his skeptical solution to these skeptical doubts. And we'll look at three different ways of interpreting that solution. What I'll call the we can live with skepticism interpretation. A second interpretation that says, look, this solution has nothing to do with knowledge or justification. It's all about the psychology by which our beliefs are produced. Interpretation number three basically says that, look, this is about knowledge and rationality, but Hume's solution is to say that knowledge and rationality are something different than we usually think. All right, so let's look at this problem again. So beliefs about unobserved matters of fact, like the sun will rise tomorrow, can only be justified by induction from past experience. So from the fact that I know that the sun has risen every day in the past. But induction will only justify its conclusion if we're justified in believing in the uniformity of nature. So in order to be justified in believing that the sun will rise tomorrow using the claim that the sun has risen every day in the past, I must be justified in believing that the future will resemble the past. So, beliefs about unobserved matters of fact can only be justified if we're justified in believing in this principle of the uniformity of nature. Well, how do we justify that principle? Well, that justification must either be through our reasoning or thought processes alone, so a priori, or we would need to justify the uniformity of nature through induction from our past experiences. But that principle can't be justified using just our thought because there's no contradiction in the way nature works changing at random times. There's no contradiction in denying that nature is uniform. Right. But this principle also can't be justified by induction from our past experiences. So I can't say, hey, look, nature was uniform in the past, therefore nature will probably be uniform in the future. Because that kind of argument is assuming that the past is a reliable guide to the future, which is just to say that that kind of argument assumes the conclusion it's trying to prove, and the argument becomes circular. All right. Thus, beliefs about unobserved matters of fact, like law of gravity, the sun will rise tomorrow, cannot be justified. Right. Now, in Hume's scholarship, there's two different families of interpretation of how Hume understands this problem. There's the epistemological interpretation, which is how we've framed the problem mostly. But there's also a psychological interpretation. So the epistemological interpretation says that, according to Hume, the problem is that our inductive reasoning can't justify our beliefs about these unobserved matters of fact. The psychological interpretation says, look, this isn't about knowledge or justification. Rather, it's just the claim that our beliefs about these unobserved matters of fact, like the sun will rise tomorrow, according to Hume, are not produced by our understanding or any process of reasoning. There's no argument we use to reach that belief that the sun will rise tomorrow. To support the epistemological interpretation of what Hume is doing, you might sort of point to places where Hume speaks fondly of the ancient skeptics and fondly about their attempt to confine or limit the bounds of our understanding, where they say we shouldn't sort of form beliefs beyond what our understanding can actually reach. He also refers to his solution as being a solution to a skeptical problem. Well, skepticism is usually associated with challenges to our knowledge or justification. Similarly, he calls his solution a skeptical solution, and that suggests a sort of epistemological bent to these considerations. Now, even if this isn't the right interpretation of Hume, the epistemological interpretation still gives rise to a problem that needs to be considered very carefully, because it lies at the sort of foundation of how it is that we can justify basically the scientific method itself. Because the scientific method for investigating the law of gravity, law of thermodynamics, etc., relies on making observations via experiments and then using those experiments to come up with sort of laws of nature that are meant to describe not just how those particular experiments turned out, those particular observations, but are meant to describe how things will behave even in cases we haven't observed. And so we're using induction from our experience, our past experience, to claims about how things will work in future experiences as well, or unobserved cases. And so the question becomes, why should we trust science? Why are we rational in using the scientific method? Well, that's going to depend upon how can we make it sort of show that it's rational to rely on inductive methods. Regarding the interpretation of Hume, there's some reason to think that that's not the problem he necessarily had in mind. The psychological interpretation can point to these kinds of passages where Hume says, our conclusions from that experience, so from past experience, are not founded on reasoning or any process of the understanding. This seems like a claim about these sort of beliefs not being caused by sort of arguments that we go through or by a particular faculty of the mind. So the psychology that says that these are produced by our reason is just mistaken. He says, I shall allow, if you please, that the one proposition may be justly inferred from the other. I know, in fact, that it always is inferred. So future observation inferred from past experience. He says that future matter of fact may be justly inferred. It looks like he's saying the inference from past experience to future unobserved is justified. But what he's skeptical of, he says, is that if you insist that the inference is made by a chain of reasoning, I desire you to produce that reasoning. So he says, the inference is fine. He just wants to know, where does the inference come from? It's not from an argument. That's what he's skeptical of. So where does it come from? And he says, if you assert that the understanding of a child is led to this conclusion by any process of argument, I may justly require you to produce that argument. So yet again, what he's saying is, what kind of argument does a child use to gain their beliefs about the future? Because they're able to form beliefs about unobserved matters of fact from their past experience. If you think that these beliefs are the result of the faculty of reason, whereby we go through some argument to arrive at those conclusions, he says, give me the argument and show me that a child would be capable of doing it. And the idea is children do not have a fully developed capacity of reasoning yet. And so it becomes even less likely that they use anything like an argument to get to that belief. So, for instance, my son, if I take my sort of 2-year-old son, 3-year-old son, about to be 3, if I go to a movie theater and I buy him popcorn every time, well, next time I go to the movie theater, he's going to expect me to buy him popcorn. But it seems implausible that he's going through any kind of argument in his head, that he's going, premise 1, okay, Daddy took me to the movie theater 2 years ago and I got popcorn. Daddy took me to the movie theater 2 months ago and I got popcorn. Therefore, well, we're at the movie theater now, so Daddy's going to get me popcorn. No, that thought process is not going through my child's head. And so tell me the argument that you think my child's going through to get to this conclusion about this unobserved matters of fact from his past experience. It says past experience must be produce this belief in some way other than via argument or reason. All right. So what is Hume's skeptical solution? Well, he says, suppose a person has lived so long in the world as to have observed similar objects or events to be constantly conjoined together. So they see these sort of correlations in the world in their experience. Well, what's the consequence of this experience? He immediately infers the existence of one object from the appearance of the other. So I've seen the sun rise every day, so I sort of immediately infer that the sun will rise next time. Or I've seen one billiard balls hit each other, and so when I see one hit another, I assume the other one's going to sort of go off in the other direction. Yet he has not, by all his experience, acquired any idea or knowledge of the secret powers by which the one object produces the other. Nor is it by any process of reasoning he's engaged to draw this inference. So this is the sort of skepticism. But still he finds himself determined to draw it. So we make this inference despite the fact that we can't find an argument to support it. And though he should be convinced that his understanding has no part in the operation, he would nevertheless continue in the same course of thinking. So even after we've seen this sort of skepticism, we'll still make these inferences all the time. And so there is some other principle which determines him to form such a conclusion. There's some other way that he comes to this belief. He says, this principle is custom or habit. Now, this is a passage that we didn't read, but I want to sort of quote it here for you. This operation of the mind, which we infer like effects from like causes and vice versa, is so essential to the subsistence of all human creatures. So making predictions about the future is just so important to our survival. It's not probable that it could be trusted to the fallacious deductions of our reasons. So it's so important that we're able to make plans about the future and sort of adjust our behavior to those predictions that it's unlikely that it would just be left up to our reason to come to those conclusions, because we don't have very good reason, is the idea. Our reason is woefully unprepared for that task. It's more conformable to the ordinary wisdom of nature to secure so necessary an act of the mind by some instinct or mechanical tendency. So instead, it makes more sense. It'd be better for our survival if this kind of belief was just produced by some natural faculty of the mind that didn't require any sort of thought processes to go through. In the same way as nature has taught us the use of our limbs without giving us the knowledge of the muscles and nerves by which they are actuated, so she has implanted in us an instinct which carries forward the thought in a correspondent course to that which she has established among external objects, though we are ignorant of those powers and forces on which this regular course and succession of objects totally depends. So the idea is objects out in the world follow certain patterns. Now, we're not able to discover the sort of causal relations out there in the world. We're not able to experience them themselves, but nature has produced in us a way of producing ideas that sort of matches the way that sort of objects are caused to, or events are caused to occur outside of our mind. So the events in our mind sort of tracks what happens outside of our mind, because nature has set us up that way because it's important to our survival, even though we can't reason to a conclusion about the match between the two. All right, so how should we interpret this? One interpretation is what I'm going to call the we can live with skepticism interpretation. It says, our inductive inferences are unjustified. They're just not rational. We don't know them to be reliable. We can't know these things about unobserved matters of fact. However, nature solves this problem for us by compelling us to make these inferences despite their being unjustified, despite the fact that we can't give any good arguments for them. Given the nature of human minds, the force of the skeptical argument is limited to a philosophical context where we're engaged in this abstract reflection. So when we reflect on abstract principles of reason and understanding, we come to see that these beliefs are unjustified and rest on this assumption in the uniformity of nature that we can't give a non-circular sort of justification for. However, when we go outside the philosophy classroom, when we're living life, that kind of abstract reason just doesn't have any sort of hold over us. When we're living in the moment, those abstract considerations don't come to mind. And so we just sort of forget about the problem and our natural impulses take over. And some natural impulses lead us to make these predictions about the future through habit and custom, instead of relying on our reasoning so that we can survive. So he says, nor need we fear that this philosophy, while it endeavors to limit our inquiries to common life, should ever undermine the reasonings of common life and carry its doubts so far as to destroy all action as well as speculation. So there's a kind of intellectual humility being suggested here, maybe. The idea is we should recognize the limits of our knowledge and realize that we cannot justify these claims. And so we should be open-minded that we might be wrong about these things, that we don't know them to be true. But despite the fact that we should have that sort of humility, when we actually live our lives, that recognizing that fact is never going to change the fact that we actually do sort of make speculations about the future. We make predictions on the basis of these other sort of principles that don't rely on our reason. On a different interpretation, this says this has nothing to do with knowledge or rationality. So Hume isn't a skeptic. He's not trying to claim that our beliefs about matters of fact aren't rational, that we don't know them to be true. Rather, Hume is merely making the psychological claim that those beliefs are not produced by any argument. And so, because there's no argument we can find to get us to that conclusion, it isn't our faculty of understanding that produces these beliefs. And so his solution is to argue that The process by which these beliefs, the way the psychology works, is by appealing to a sort of process of custom or habit. And so essentially, if you want to understand how the mind works, it's not via some sort of rational argument that we sort of go through to arrive at sort of future beliefs about the future. Rather, the inference is the result of the natural processes of the faculty of imagination, of the way sort of our ideas sort of give rise to other ideas. So the claim here is that in our past experience, so it's not reason that leads us to these future beliefs. It's rather, we have these past experiences. I repeatedly observe A followed by B. So I repeatedly observe one billiard ball hitting another one, followed by that other billiard ball moving off in the other direction. Now, as I see this over and over and over, so when I see it, I get the idea of one billiard ball hitting another, and then I get the idea of the other billiard ball moving away because I have impressions of both. And so the idea is constantly followed by the other. And that creates a habit in our mind where the idea of A becomes associated with the idea of B. We get in the habit of moving from idea A to idea B. And so the next time we see A, because we're in that habit of moving from one idea to the next, as soon as I think about and see one billiard ball hit another, I see the first event, my mind immediately through this habit goes to the idea of B. Now, this is why if the billiard ball were just to stop, I would be surprised because I'm in the habit of going from one idea to the next. And so I'd think of the next, and then, well, when it stops, that would go against this sort of habit, this association that I have. But the claim here, so the liveliness of our idea of this event, so when I see the billiard ball hit another, that impression gives a sort of liveliness to the idea that copies that impression. And when that sort of gives rise to the idea of the billiard ball moving in the other direction afterwards, that sort of liveliness sort of rubs off onto the other idea, thereby turning it into a belief as well. All right, so let me give an example here. Think of the idea of a grandpa. When I think of the idea of a grandpa, the idea gives rise to, I think of the idea of my grandpa, a particular person, Percival Taylor. I know, awesome name. But so I think about what this person looks like, what their house was like. I think about playing hide and seek with them. And the idea here is it's because through my past experience, whenever I thought about the idea of grandpa, usually it was around my grandpa Taylor. And usually when I interacted with my grandpa Taylor, that was around his house, playing hide and seek with him, etc. And so this idea of a grandpa, through my past experiences, through this habit, through this association that when one idea arose, the other ideas were there too as well, those other impressions. Through those habits, when I think about the idea, it causes me to think about the other idea as well, just through that association. Now, in this case, it's just an imagination. So when I imagine the idea of a grandpa, I don't have a belief there. And so there's no liveliness to transfer from my belief to the ideas it's associated with. But when I actually associate two ideas and then I see one of those ideas, so the thought of one gives rise to the other, when I actually have an impression of one, that gives a liveliness to the idea, and then I associate that with the other idea, and that sort of liveliness rubs off so that I believe that that other idea will happen as well. And that's why I form a belief about the future. A final interpretation that we'll talk about says, yes, this is all about knowledge and rationality, but Hume is also not a skeptic. Hume thinks we do have knowledge and justification for beliefs about the future, for beliefs about the unobserved. But that knowledge or rationality is not what you thought it was. We need to rethink what knowledge and rationality are. So on this interpretation, rationalist philosophers like Descartes believed that some of our beliefs about unobserved matters of fact had a certain kind of justification. They had the kind of justification you get from sort of going through from your own first-person perspective. You go through your own experience and sort of reasoning and sort of thought processes, and by going through your own sort of first-person thought process, you can see how it is likely to be true that this future event will occur, and that's why that is justified. Hume is denying that these beliefs have that kind of justification, because when you go through that sort of first-person process of reasoning to try to show to yourself that these beliefs are probably true, that they have this kind of evidence that sort of makes them likely to be true, he says you get stuck in that circle. You can't do it. However, on this view, Hume's skeptical solution is to say that, yes, we should be skeptical of that kind of justification, but there's a different kind of justification or rationality that our beliefs about the unobserved might have. So in epistemology today, there's often a distinction made between two families of theories regarding justification, rationality, and knowledge. There are internalist theories that say knowledge or justification depends solely on factors internal to a person. So it's only facts that a person is aware of, that are sort of included in their own conscious awareness, their own conscious reasoning, that could provide justification to their beliefs. All right. Now, externalist views say that, well, no, it's not just internal factors that can make a difference. They say external factors, so some facts that a person is unaware of, that are not part of their own conscious reasoning, could sort of be relevant to providing their belief with justification. So certain truths of which I'm unaware might help to justify the beliefs that I have. And so one view on this interpretation, the view is that Hume is arguing that we lack internalist justification for these inductive beliefs. So we can't justify our beliefs about the future solely by appealing to facts of which we are aware and can justify using our own sort of internal thought processes. However, Hume's skeptical solution is to say the justification for these beliefs, the rationality of these beliefs, is determined by facts that we are unaware of. So the idea is, since induction is reliable, even though we're not aware of it, we don't sort of know about it, if induction is reliable, it provides us with justification for its conclusions. So on this view, the claim is, look, nature is uniform. Thankfully, we've been set up such that the way we form beliefs using induction matches the way the world works outside of us. We assume that that nature is uniform, and nature is uniform. We can't justify that using our own internal reasoning, but since they match, the idea is these beliefs are reliably formed and are thereby justified. And so on this view, the idea is nature needs to be uniform in order for our inductive beliefs to be justified. But we needn't have internal access. We needn't be aware of the fact that nature is uniform in order for our inductive beliefs to be justified. So it just has to be true. And that's what makes these beliefs rational. So there are a number of other sort of possible responses. There's a number of other possible interpretations of Hume, but we're going to stick with those three. So that's it for this video. See y'all next time. Bye-bye.